Hey guys, welcome to Historical Podcast. I always feel like I'm going to trip over that lately, go back to the old Irish medieval history. Regardless, we're now over here in Historical Podcast, so make sure you subscribe and give us a like. This week's topic is a really interesting one, and I feel like it's a topic a lot of people trip over, and that is, what is a Viking? And I think the best person here to explain what a Viking actually is definitely Denton here. Good morning, Denton. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping very well. So far, so good. So I can't complain. And thank you for that wonderfully implied compliment there. I just hope I can actually remember something to say. So we're going to talk about the term Viking. One of the most misunderstood, misused terms there is really historically. Virtually everybody gets it wrong, and that includes museums, documentaries, and so forth. And it's something I find rather hard to understand because it isn't that difficult. I mean, the Norse word Vikinger, really, it's hard to put an exact translation on it, but I mean, you could call it a pirate, a privateer, an adventurer, a seafarer. But it really involves ships. And if you got in a ship and you went off somewhere and you did something, well, you were a Vikinger. But if you didn't get in a ship, you weren't. And you could say that every Viking was a Norseman or woman in some case, but not every Norse person was a Viking. In fact, the number of actual Vikings would have been quite a small percentage of the Scandinavian population, because most of them were not sailing off in ships with dragon heads on them and raping anything that had a pulse and burning monasteries and doing all that sort of thing. So it's quite a misunderstood term. Like you could go Viking and be a Viking. So I think that's sort of the basic bottom line of it.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
No, I mean, I think it's funny because you could almost equate it to an earlier, in a lot of ways, like a knight. Knights were a small percentage of a population. There's certain rules to being a knight. You couldn't just be one. But no one turns around and goes, I'm a knight on Facebook or any other social media platforms, but they go, I'm a Viking. And I don't know whether it's because there is that slight ambiguity with the translation of the name, that it opens it up to people sort of putting their own interpretations into it and claiming that as well. Plus, I know that, Norse and Old English and everything like that, language changes over generations, and people, I have noticed people have started to say, well, okay, it meant that 1,000 years ago, but over time and pop culture and everything like that, we've managed and we've turned it into this as a sort of shadow of its former self, which I don't have a problem when people do that as a way to connect to their ancestry or anything like that. But I do have a problem that when it gets misidentified, that when it comes back again, so it goes out into the general public and they misinterpret whatever or interpret it the way they wish to interpret it, and then it feeds its way back into the historical community and then it's treated as fact. And it's like, that's where I feel the problem is with it. Not with people putting on coal on their face and going, I'm a Viking, fine. If you want to be in the modern era and that translation, I'm not going to argue with you. But when it's, like I said, when it starts to come back into the community, in that wave effect, that's where I start to get a bit twitch.
I do find it a bit annoying when I see people who, I'm a Viking. Well, okay, if you could go back 1,000 years, get in a ship, go off somewhere and do something. You could be descended from Vikings, you can have Norse ancestry, but you really can't be a Viking, It's like some of the I saw one of these survivalist or weird armed groups, and they were saying, I'm a Nazi, Yeah. But to be one, you'd have to be a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which hasn't taken membership since 1945. You could dress like one, but you can't be one, you know. And it's the same with Vikings, you know. If you didn't get in a ship and do something, and, you know, there's even the thing about the ship. It will also depend what kind of ship you were in. Now, this is something that often doesn't come up. I mean, people think about Vikings, and of course, you have something like this, little dragon head, rows of shields, lots of guys rowing. But the true Vikings would have been in something like this, which was a warship. But after, let's say when they founded Dublin, here, the ships that would be coming into Dublin would not have been those warships. They'd have been Knorrs. They would have been cargo ships. You couldn't carry a lot of cargo in a longship. The odd longship would come in. But and the crew on a cargo ship, they weren't really Viking. You know, I mean, these guys were just merchants going to and fro. So there's even a bit of inconsistency there. The guys on the dragon-headed ships, you know, jumping off, waving axes and that, okay, you know, they're your Vikings. But once they settled down, and even now we have a big thing here in Dublin, the Dublinia exhibit, which is very good. There's models of Dublin through the Middle Ages in the Norse times, people in costume and all that. But even there, they refer to Viking Dublin. And say, no, there was no such thing as Viking Dublin, or Difflin, as they called it. It was a Norse settlement, because the people living there were settlers. They weren't jumping off ships waving axes. They weren't Vikings. You know, the Vikings were the guys who came first around 840-something, set up the Longport, and then Dublin grew out of that. But the settlers later on were not Vikings, because they weren't in ships. They weren't, you know, they were not coming from somewhere, going somewhere in a ship. And that's quite a misnomer. Like, I often see it mentions how the Dublin Vikings and the native Irish fought together against Brian Boru. Okay, well, you know, Broder Man and the Jarl who came down from the Orkneys, they were Vikings. They were coming in warships to fight. But the people in Dublin, they were just Norse settlers. They weren't Vikings. So there's a misconception there in the terminology.
And just to reinforce that as well, when we have Flann Sinna, who comes in around the late 10th century, the early 10th century and the late 9th century, the first thing he does is that he purposely knocks out all the Vikings. And the reason why he knocks all the Vikings out is because they're the one who are going in, kidnapping people from Meath, from the Northern Ale, from Munster. But he keeps all the actual Scandinavians. Archaeological proof supports the fact that the Scandinavians were not touched. The people who were kicked out of Dublin were the Ever, because they were making their major profit was the slave trade, and the Vikings that came with them. He did not touch the everyday Scandinavian, was not touched. Why? Because Flann Sinna wasn't a racist. You know, he only got rid of and removed the dirty, evil gangs that were corroding away at Ireland, you know, as written in the annals of Ulster, you know. So that really supports it, you know.
You know, it's a very interesting point. And I mean, that's often not mentioned, that when the Irish retook Dublin for a period, they had no problem with the settlers. It was only the people you could actually call Vikings who were going out armed, taking captives and things like that. So it shows actually a decency on the part of the Irish, the fact that they were accepting these people as citizens in Difflin. But yes, there's quite a distinction made there. But today it's become that everybody was a Viking, you know. And the term Viking has come to be used for anything, be it music, culture, art, farming methods. You know, I mean, there was no Viking music or art. There was a lot of Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian music and art, but there was no Viking, unless they composed a song to sing on a ship. But you know, but the term Viking has now come to mean every single activity that was engaged in by Norse people. If you're a farmer, you know, and I mean, if you'd gone back to the 9th century, say, and you're walking along in Norway and there's a farmer plowing his field, if you'd said, "Are you a Viking?" he'd have said, "See a ship here. What's the matter? Happy to be a Viking. I'm not in a ship. I'm plowing my field," you know, because he wasn't, you know. And at this point, it's got like the horned helmet. You know, people have this idea, and it's so totally wrong, and it is completely hard get rid of it. Even here in the Dubliner exhibit, they have little horn helmet key figures and things. And I find that a bit annoying because I think museums, documentaries, dispel that. You say, no, these guys didn't. These guys didn't go around in these things. Wagner operas, yeah, they did. But the nearest thing that a Viking ever got to a horned helmet was, of course, in the Viking operas. I don't know if have you seen the very funny Norwegian series, Norsemen?
Yes, I have.
No.
And in that, one of the guys comes down and they're all saying, "What's that?" You look like an idiot, with those horns on your helmet, But yes, it is strange that these misconceptions,
Well, I think they're often played on by Scandinavian countries as well today, with tourism and this sort of reinventing of their previous cultures, groups and stuff. We do it in Ireland too with the Irish, and and you go into Dublin and there's certain parts of Dublin, it's almost like too green, and and I'm sure other places do the same. So, and I think that is often mistaken by people when they go, well, look, if you look at this picture of someone in Norway, at a Viking festival, and you're like, yeah, but it's just
some of them are bad. Yes, I must. Most of the reenactments are good now. They have the ocular helmets or the nasal helmets that don't have the horns, and I think actually certainly the Scandinavian countries should try and reverse that that image. But I mean, I've seen really good documentaries, which should know better. I mean, you get something on National Geographic or whatever, and these people are portrayed as raiding all the time, which is another thing that annoys me. Like all Norsemen, all they ever did was sail around raiding. The vast majority of Norsemen stayed home and farmed or set up settlements elsewhere and farmed. Raiding was, something that a minority did. But you'll get documentaries, and there are some of them when I start. The savagery of the Vikings, these evil, terrorized Europe. And there's guys leaping. I'm going to pass on this one because this is just going to be 3/4 of an hour of rape, murder, pillage. And Hollywood, of course, has played a part in that. But I suppose if we expect Hollywood to get anything right, a pet hate of mine is the United States cavalry in Hollywood movies because they have the wrong uniforms, wrong guns, wrong flags, wrong forts. And if they had ridden up to an average Western fort, they wouldn't have been let in because nobody would have known who they were. We're the cavalry. We are, pal. What are those uniforms? Hollywood has not helped. And when I see something like the Thor movies, I mean, here's Heimdall with dreadlocks, and the Rainbow Bridge looks like an airport runway with flashing lights down. But I mean, I know people who think that is genuine Norse mythology. That Valhalla actually looked like that there were black Valkyries riding around on obviously relatives of Pegasus with wings sticking out of their horses, and people see this and they think that this is real, and that's why I think the like of museums and that should make a point of saying, well, no, that's Richard Wagner, that's Hollywood, this is not the real thing, especially places in Scandinavia. So that would certainly be my wonderful learned opinion on that.
You're just right on the fact of like whenever you see something from a documentary and they're like make out the Vikings are just these raper pillagers and they just do it for the crack, and it's like they very rarely go into the social, economical, or political reasons why these groups were out doing that. Whether they were leaving Norway because of Fairhair's rigid regime of kiss my feet or bugger off, or and very Denmark's sort of issues with overpopulation in some areas and stuff. These sort of things were happening outside of that. That were causing these groups to migrate and not just migrate, but obviously then raid as well. So there are so many layers to this, and I think to myself, why do you just go for that? Like you say, the rape, pillage, and murder when
they never go into detail about other things, and especially now you get this thing about how the Vikings, you see, that they hated Christianity. Look, they burned monasteries, they raided. Yes, because all the money in those days was in churches. The church had more money than the average king, and I mean, if Jews and Muslims had the money, they would have raided synagogues and mosques, and they'd have walked past the Christian church. So people have this idea, they hated Christianity. No, they did what a burglar did. I mean, a burglar doesn't break into a house with raggedy curtains on the window and that. He goes into the house that has the Porsche outside and the swimming pool in the back. This is what the Vikings were doing. They went where the money was. They didn't give a fig about Christianity as a rule, So there's another total misconception that they have this hatred of Christianity,
To completely back up what you're saying, Denton, right? The moment the Vikings from Norway come in, the first thing they do, they go and sack every single church. And guess what? After they're settled for about 50 years, what did they do? The first thing they do is put protection money over every single church that they had been raiding for years. One very good example is Iona. Iona first was sacked by the Vikings multiple times. And then when the Ivar finally settled in the Isles between Scotland and Ireland, one of the first places that they put under their protection is Iona. Why? Because that's where the money is at. They only cared about the money. If they didn't like Christianity, they would have completely leveled the church, and then they would have put a big pagan temple or whatever paganism they wanted on top of it. But they never did, and no one ever questions this.
No one ever notices this. Well, I mean, we had a situation in Cork where there was a monastery right beside the Norse settlement. And the monks used to trade. And I mean, this was quite early on. And at that time, the monks must have been the only monks in Ireland at that time who were glad to see a big sail on the horizon coming in their direction. So, I mean, you have this relationship where there wasn't in fact, the Norse never persecuted Christians like the Christians persecuted them.
Yeah.
They didn't have a barbecue in the town square to which you were the barbecue because you didn't believe the way they did. They didn't have that. They didn't have that approach. They didn't have missionaries. There was no such thing as a pagan missionary trying to convert someone. And it's also noteworthy when the Christian church was trying to convert Scandinavia. The early missionaries, they weren't killed. They weren't ill-treated. The Norse attitude was either we're not interested, go away, or well, you can build a church over there if you like, but we don't really care. There was no real persecution of Christian missionaries. They were not killed. Whereas, if of course pagan missionaries had existed and had gone to a Christian country, well, I would say their chance of a long life would have been rather limited. So this hatred of Christianity really was a complete myth. Obviously, some people would have disliked Christians, usually because something the Christians had done to them, and they could. Like when Armagh was sacked and they had a sacrifice to Odin on the altar of the cathedral, saying, well, like, our God is better than your God. But I mean, that kind of incident wasn't all that common. And you could see why they would do that, because the church were more or less saying, well, our God is great, your gods are not. Well, okay, we just did this on your altar, where's Ivar the Boneless and the English king, or, if I shoot arrows into you, will your God protect Saint Sebastian?
Yeah.
Oh yes,
I was about to say that because Olaf the White, the sacrifice on the altar. I think, are you taking that from Olaf the White? Is it?
Well, it's been attributed to Ivar and Bainlau to Olaf the White. Not 100% sure which.
Because I know Olaf the White. He used to do all that kind of stuff just to wind up the Christians. The Irish. For instance, he once he picked up one of his wives and he just shoved her onto the altar, and he got her to pronounce an entire prophecy and stuff. And the only reason he did it was to really rev up the Christians. It was the same when he went over to Tara. He went purposely digging up all the bodies and stuff. And the reason why he did it, once again, was to rev up everyone around him. He was a proper winder. And what do you expect? His best friend was Ivor the Bonus. If your best friend is Ivor the Bonus, you're probably twisted and have a twisted sense of humor. So he wasn't doing it because he hated Christians. He most likely did it because he thought it was funny.
But that's the thing.
Yes. Well, I mean, look at the cooperation actually between the Norse and the Irish. I mean, when Ivar and Olafur were going to Britain, they recruited Irish chieftains to keep an eye on Dublin while they were gone. So I mean, they were quite happy to. And the Irish, this idea of constant warfare, Irish Norse. I mean, a Norse chieftain would help an Irish chieftain to go and beat the crap out of some other Irish chieftain. And then, the Irish chieftain would help the Norse guy to beat the crap out of some Norseman. So there was an awful lot of that going on, but you never heard about it, or indeed the Norse fighting each other. I mean, what the Norwegians and the Danes had a big battle in Dundalk Bay on one occasion, so they were fighting each other as well. And these things you never get. You just have this image of there's the Vikings, there's the Irish. They're always fighting, and the Vikings are doing nothing but burn churches, rape any woman who's actually got a pulse, or maybe even some who don't. And this is completely false.
But that's the thing. People often conflate that. They often think if they see a missionary has been killed, or a certain king of a Scandinavian country or chieftain has gone on a rampage, taken out all the Christians within his realm, they mix that up as that some sort of Norse social attitudes towards Christians, when actually it can just be the leader. Now, I often think to myself, whenever people sort of correlate anything they've read in the annals and then they sort of translate it back to, and I think to myself, have you actually just put into consideration human attitudes in general? We live in a country now where, half the people probably have no interest in whatever the Prime Minister is saying, or, and does that mean that everything that Prime Minister does or says represents everyone in that country? No. And it was the same then, and which is why you would have factions, often families fighting families, because they just didn't agree the way certain things were going. And that's the same with the way Christians were treated. I did laugh there and I was going to say, when you were saying about they went where the money was, if it was Jews or if it was Muslims, it would be the same. And I thought to myself, well, we saw that with Jewish settlements in the Western, Europe, all through the early and late and Middle Ages, where they were welcomed in till they got a certain amount of money, and then it was like, the king will have that and expel you. It's just, it doesn't matter. It's always where the money is.
And of course, you had your blood feuds and this like going on. And but it's interesting. The only occasion really when it could be said that the Norse deliberately went to destroy churches was after the St. Brice's Day massacre, because a relative of the King of Norway got killed by that completely, utterly useless Ethelred the Unready, who maybe should really be better termed Ethelred the Completely Useless. And then, yes, they came over and they systematically went around destroying churches, but they had a very good reason for it, because they were paying back this Christian king for what was a betrayal, because basically he was massacring peaceful settlers who had done nothing in his kingdom. So, I mean, the one big example of the Norse actually going around targeting churches because they were churches, not because they had money in them. There's a very good reason for it. This was revenge for something done to them, So I think that's
Denton, if they're there. So to go a Viking is when you go a raiding. So if you have a Scandinavian who's going out of his way to take a revenge attacks, that doesn't really make him a Viking now, does it? He's
because the ship was the element of Vikinger. It was actually the thing. I mean, you get, say, like the TV series Vikings. In the first episode of that, Ragnar and Lagertha are farmers. He only becomes a Viking when he gets in the ship and he goes to England. She only becomes a Viking when she does the same later on. But when they come back, they get out of the ship, they go back to their lodge. Well, they're farmers again. They're no longer Vikings because they're not connected with the ship. So, I mean, the ship was really the integral part. So, say a party of Norse people from Dyflin go out to attack some Irish people who'd annoyed them. Technically, they're not really Vikings, because the townspeople, they're settlers who are maybe defending their homes or whatever. If they sailed into the harbour in a ship, got out of the ship, and went and did the same thing, well, okay, they're Vikings. They've come in a ship. They've got out of the ship. But settlers, say, fighting with the native Irish, weren't technically Vikings. These were settlers. If you like, they were defending their settlements. They were fighting with the Irish. It's a subtle difference, but it is a difference, because technically they were not Vikings, because ships were not involved. Subtle point, but because it didn't really matter to you. I mean, if you got your head cleaved with an axe, it was all the same whether the guy had just got off the ship or he just left his farm. I mean, your head was going in two directions either way. It didn't really matter to you very much.
And another very interesting thing, definitely, is the whole people getting bogged down with the word Viking. Some people seem to be applying the word Viking to every single raider that appears. For example, we have the Moorish pirates who are hanging around Spain and Portugal, and it kind of leaves people confused to if there were African Vikings or not. And I think some people are just getting bogged down with the word African, Moorish pirates who are hanging around and are raiding at the same time as the Vikings. Could you explain anything about that? Like, are Moorish pirates Vikings, or?
No, of course not. The Barbary Pirates, the Moorish ones, I mean, they were North African, they were Semites, they would be Semitic people. And what is now, Algeria, Morocco, all along there, and the south of Spain, which is the Moorish Caliphate. But there is a thing now where the term African is being brought in, and people are trying to imply that it's sub-Saharan.
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually a plaque on Hadrian's Wall about the black community that existed on Hadrian's Wall. And the black community was a cohort of Roman troops raised in North Africa, who, of course, were not sub-Saharan. They were not black. They weren't a community. It'd be like saying, well, the Irish community in Lebanon, because the Irish army were part of the UN there. They were stationed there for a while. But you have this implication that these were sub-Saharan. And this is becoming, I think, a bit of a problem, because this is being, we see it with the BBC, because we have a black Anne Boleyn, we have a black Roman centurion, we even have black ancient Britons. And this, frankly, is getting quite ridiculous. But people are mixing these terms up. And like this with the Romans, you have, there were all these black Roman soldiers. Yes, they were North African. They aren't black. They were like modern Arabs. But there's an awful lot of that kind of confusion. And I wouldn't be at all surprised that we end up with black Vikings. I mean, that's quite possible, because people just seem to be mixing up these things, And some of them the BBC have their own little agenda for these things.
The problem I have with it, and my wife is Japanese, as you know yourself, Denton, is that when you start mixing up, people kind of lose their own identity. And a lot of African, especially African Americans, are very proud of their African history and stuff. And I think it's an absolute shame not to do Moorish pirates. Like, Moorish pirates, when did they ever get covered? We cover the Vikings all the time. And now, instead of just covering and educating ourselves with African history, we're just going to replace it with Viking history. And if you feel bad, you can just be a part of Viking history. Let's forget about yours. That's kind of the way I feel about it.
The Barbary Pirates, and that would make quite an interesting subject, because they existed for centuries. In fact, they existed right up until the 19th century, when Stephen Decatur, the American naval hero, took the original USS Enterprise. And he went to North Africa and he got rid of the Barbary Pirates. So, they were existing right down into the 19th century, the late 18th, early 19th century. But that's a topic that's never really touched on. And in fact, there's a lot of African subjects. And I think, the Black Pride people and all this, they overlook so much of it. How often do you see something about, say, Shaka Zulu, about the Amazons of Dahomey? There are all these African stories. There was a woman actually that did a lot of animated stuff. She drew them, produced them, voiced them. Very good, but they were African legends, the gods and goddesses of Africa. Fascinating. But people just ignore all that. So that's a whole aspect of culture that really is overlooked. And then they start mixing it in with the Viking, which is we saw that in the Thor movies. Which is hardly, I suppose, surprising, since they got everything wrong except the names, and even some of those were wrong. But they started doing it. Like when we have a black Valkyrie clad in 14th century armor, riding around on a winged horse, which is, this is, I just don't get this. I don't get this at all. But then again, as I said, I know people who think the Thor movies actually Norse mythology.
The thing is that Vikings are mostly people who are heavily connected with the Scandinavian trade system and the Scandinavian areas of Viking plunder. And African people and Vikings actually got on quite well. I know that you can find a few examples here and there of raiders specifically coming from Scandinavian dominant areas and going into Spain and Portugal and attacking African areas. But for the most part, looking at the actual hard facts of finds, in particular Muslim coins that have been found pretty much all over Scandinavia, it seems for the most part African people and Vikings got on quite well, There
was a lot of trade. There's over 200,000 Arabic silver coins have been found in Scandinavia alone. there's been bits of material with actually like Arabic writing on it. I mean, the likes of Bjorn Ironside, who went into the Mediterranean. Yes, there seems to have been a lot of trade and items brought back. I mean, we know the Norse got as far as the Caspian to Baghdad, and there's even Indian, like Buddhas and things, came back.
Oh,
So it's quite, not that they went as far as India, but they obviously got those probably from the Arabs. So yes, there was a lot of trading, as they did in Constantinople. So yes, we have to assume that they got on fairly well. I mean, there aren't really any accounts of there any great battles along the North African coast. There were in Spain, but yeah, there certainly would have been quite a bit of influence there. As I say, those silver coins are proof of the amount of trading that went on. It's quite interesting. Again, it's a bit overlooked. And of course, now we actually have possibly the start of the Viking Age put back maybe a century, because the two ships that were found on the island in Estonia that are dated to anywhere from 50 to 100 years before 793. So either you could say the Vendel era extended longer, or the Viking Age began earlier, but these ships had crossed the Baltic from Sweden, so they are the first sort of known example. It's provable of people from the Scandinavian countries going off in a ship somewhere. Whether they were raiding, trading, or what, we don't know. They were armed. Could have been a raiding mission. It could have been a trading mission that went wrong. It does go back a bit.
Because that's what I was about to ask you there. Like, if we can't identify that earlier boat, what is the proper definition of the Viking? Is it just a boat? Does it have to be a certain class of people? If a noble goes and raids his enemy, is that noble a Viking, or is it just farmers? Is it a class system, or is it just for?
This is an interesting one. But I mean, if you're taking the term Viking as meaning pirate, privateer, sea related, then the guy who goes on horseback with his guys all marching behind him isn't a Viking. He's just a king leading his army. Whereas if he took a ship and they all jumped off a ship waving axes, well, then they'd count as Vikings. So it's one of those. I mean, you might say in the saga where Ragnar's sons sail across to attack Sweden, that Aslog goes on land leading an army. Well, you could say, well, they were the Vikings, but she was just leading the troops. It's an interesting thing. But I mean, strictly speaking, yes, to be a Viking, you really had to have a ship. And with the discovery of those ships in Estonia, it's quite possible that they were actually doing things long before 793. 793 is the famous date because everybody knows it. But it was certainly the first big raid to the west, but it looks as if they were certainly going across the Baltic the other way, much earlier.
But the problem is with that is that we don't know if they were Vikings or not. And when I say that, I mean, we don't know if they were raiding. They could have just built that boat just to show off,
Well, arrowheads were found that would have been embedded in the timbers.
Well, that's quite
and they were armed, and apparently nobody knows now how they were buried, because one of the ships, they're all lying around willy-nilly, like there was a battle and they were left lying there. The other ship, they were all carefully arranged in rows, with the ordinary guys at the bottom and the nobles on top, fancy weapons on top, plain ones down below. Who did that? Was there a third ship? And it was the Norse people who did it? Was the local people who defeated them did it? We don't really know. Somebody did that. But the ship had, apparently there were animals on board. There were hawks for falconry. It's quite possible that it was a trading mission and a raiding mission. It could have been diplomatic. And it could have started out as a trade or a diplomatic mission, and they just thought, oh, there's a nice handy looking place over there, we'll raid it on the way home, and that just went wrong. Nobody really knows. It could be any combination of that. But there were arrows found there, and as far as I know, some of them were the fire arrow, which is like a little page, and you put the material into it to light it. So it does look as if there was either some kind of a sea battle, or that maybe ended up on land or whatever. But nobody really knows because it could have been any combination of that.
Yeah.
And even if it was a trading mission, you might technically say, well, yeah, okay, call them Vikings. They got in the ship and they went somewhere. But that certainly does seem to put the start of the Viking Age maybe back a bit. And I mean, we know they had ships long before that because you see these rock painting of ships. But yeah, it's really impossible to say like when they actually started doing the raiding. Though probably raiding on foot had been going on for quite a long time. One king, he's going over into the next Yaldom and all that sort of thing. When they actually started to, I think it really probably would have started when the ships were big enough to carry a mast, because the early like the Nidum boat and all of these, they weren't strong enough for a mast. But the two ships that were found in Estonia, they were the first probably ships to have a mast and a sail, and it was probably only when they got that they got these were seagoing vessels. Previously, the ships would have been coastal vessels. Well, here's the storm coming, quick, scurry into the nearest anchorage, But it would be only when they got seagoing vessels that were capable of going out across the Baltic, for example, which is quite a stormy sea, that they could become really true Vikings, because while they were, they could still raid along the coast, but they couldn't voyage across long distances. Like they wouldn't have been able to go to England or anything like that. It's a bit hard to actually date on these things.
Yeah, it is, because you hear a lot of the time when people do debate when did the Viking Age start, they always highlight the fact that this is the goal. This is more like, although you had raids before this is kind of the golden age of raiding. This is when people are you're going in lightning fast and hitting lightning hard. Just to return back to my argument of, can a Viking be put into different classes? I personally, like yourself, do believe that it doesn't matter on the class, that a noble can be put down as a Viking, just like a farmer can be put down as a Viking from the Scandinavian world. And the reason why I say this is that the Emer, the Irish Vikings, they truly, if you read the Orkney sagas or the Finn cycle, they really embody what it is to be a Viking. They spend most of their time sailing or camping. They spend very little time inside Dublin. They're always on the march, and the majority of the time, the Emer are making a profit by raiding. Like, unlike many of the other kings who have to have a very balanced little kingdom, the Emer, the Irish Vikings, and I do highlight that. I do like. I can easily say Irish Viking because the Emer really embody what it is to be a Viking, and they happen to live in Ireland. And so that's why I personally don't hesitate using the word Irish Viking, although the correct terminology is Highburn or Scandinavian. I just don't hesitate in using the word Irish Viking just because...
You're right. You're right on that. And also, of course, it has to be pointed out that the kingdom of Dyflin actually extended over into Britain, because it occupied an area roughly from Liverpool today up to the Scottish border as well.
Yeah, it does.
And also up in the Orkneys and that, because they had relations up there. So it was far larger than just Dublin and the surrounding counties here. And certainly I don't think class had anything to do with being a Viking. I mean, the Jarl or the King and Olaf the fisherman and Sven the pig farmer, they were all the same. They were all in the boat. They were all going somewhere, and it wouldn't have made any difference, I think, to their Vikingness.
No, I don't think so.
And also, another thing, of course, that we see, I think, also is wrong. You have a whole shipload of guys, and you see this in a lot of documentaries, and every single one of them has chainmail, helmet, shield. Only the Jarls, only the top warriors would have had swords because they were very expensive. They would have been the only ones fully armored with helmets and all that. Unless, if you killed someone, you could take his armor. You could have had the pig farmer who had lovely chainmail and a helmet because he took it off a body. That's fine. But
I did hear a good argument. The reason why a farmer is raiding in the first place is so he can feed himself and his family. So if he does happen to get mail, the first thing he's thinking to himself is to cash in that, sell it to the local lord straight away. Get up to that lord and say, Lord, I have this beautiful mail. would I be able to keep all the wheat that I profited from this year? And he'll look at the mail and say, yeah, you keep that wheat over there. I don't mind. And easily click on that mail, you know?
That's a very good point. I mean, if some guy who only went on, I mean, most of the people who went on raids were occasional. They were part-time. You know, very few Vikings lived entirely off raiding. Most of them were fishermen, farmers, whatever. They went raiding, you know, sort of in the off-season kind of thing. Yes, if he found some beautiful sword or a helmet all decorated, you know, yes, he could. It would be more likely he might actually, as you say, offer it to the Jarl or something. Or, well, now can I not give you 3 pigs and 2 sheep this year, and you can have this, you know? Yeah. Or he could have wanted himself. But this idea that every single man was armored. I mean, most of them would have just had their own clothes, maybe a leather cap, and they'd have had things like axes, spears. And, you know, you might bring the axe you use for woodworking because that'll cleave somebody's head just as well as But that's another sort of false image. Every single Viking looking like a housecarl, which is a different thing. They would, you know, the retainers of the Jarls and Kings, they would be fully armored. But it was the same even when you come down into later times, like King Harold's army at Hastings and that. A lot of those men were unarmored. They'd have brought pikes and hay forks and shovels and all sorts of weird the feared, you know. It would only be the housecarls and the prominent nobles who would have been fully armored with helmets and everything. You wouldn't have seen many helmets on the feared.
Well, that never really changed even to the high medieval era, you know, that you would still have your levies of farmers. I'll always remember the beautiful scene, and I would say aesthetically as beautiful, a Braveheart of the Stirling battle of the English army coming in all in the synchronized armor and tunics and it is an amazing sight to behold, but it would have looked nothing like that. Now obviously we don't need to pick apart Braveheart, it's been done enough, but it's just an example of I know these programs and stuff do it for the aesthetics, but if you're doing a documentary or something like that, I think it's, you know, that
was good. That was one of the best things in Braveheart. The English army were all professionally equipped. Scots, some of them had gear, some of them didn't. Well, you would have got it with, say, the Romans in Gaul. I mean, the Legion would all be beautifully armored. The other lot, some of them could be naked, some of them had helmets. You know, they were a mixed bag, and you would have had that very much with the Vikings. Only, because I mean, a sword, for example, was very expensive. No, so every ordinary man would not have had a sword, and in fact, spears and axes were probably more effective than a sword. A spear has a much greater range than a sword, unless you're good with the sword. So it's another one of the sort of misconceptions. Of course, then in Vikings, they kind of went the other way, where nobody wears a helmet. I mean, only Ivar the Boneless actually has a helmet at any time in the show, whereas the Saxons are all going around with it. And so they went the other way. They didn't, I mean, okay, no horned helmets, that was good, but there weren't any helmets at all, which was kind of going the opposite way. You know? Then, of course, Vikings is, you know, the Last Kingdom, I think, is a better made show. I don't know, based on the Bernard Cornwall books. It's actually better from the dress point of view. And their recreation of towns of the time are very good, with the muddy streets. And in fact, Bernard Cornwall's books, I think, are excellent. I don't know whether you've ever read them.
Yeah, I love them.
I mean, you could learn about the 8th and 9th centuries from his books, because everything, dress, weapons, methods of warfare, you know, it is brilliantly researched, and he gets it right. Unlike so many authors who get it gloriously wrong.
Yes.
Programs we see now, I mean, not necessarily even Viking ones, but medieval stuff, and that they are so gloriously off. You just, I totally despair. You know. So
we've often
it literally breaks my heart, like.
And the problem is, haven't we?
Sorry?
No, I was just saying we've often talked about is that, and we brought it up in previous things on previous channels and stuff. The aesthetic argument versus the historical argument. And where the line.
This is the problem I have, Michael. I know we've had this conversation like a billion times, but as we've talked here about what is a Viking, the thing is, when you're reading the sagas, one of my favorite sagas is Nile Saga Although my friends tried to talk me into reading it a million times, and I only read it in the last 2 years. But Null Saga is amazing because it really embodies what it is to be a Viking. And then when you switch over to the Finn cycle and you get this boys will be boys kind of mentality on the field, and then you go back over to the sagas again, it really embodies this testosterone mad society of lads getting in there, doing a Viking, exploring, seeing the bigger world. And I think that magic gets lost when they get into this kind of silly modern romance of these pagan warriors trying to undermine the Christian society. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's about these lads. One's a farmer, the other one's a noble who's up his own ass. The other fella who's trying to fucking murder everyone around him. Another lad's trying to prove himself so he can charm some woman. All that magic is lost in modern society.
You know, it is. And I agree with you. In fact, the comedy show Norsemen actually gets it more right.
Yeah,
like their attitude, what they're doing and bringing back captives and that, and treating the captives actually quite well. I mean, like the guy who just loves being a slave. Oh, I love being a slave. You know, it actually is more correct than the serious one, like Vikings. You know, I love some of their humor too. A lot of it is so well based on mythology, like where the guy's accused of rape. Amonot wasn't really a chieftain rape and then he reversed roles and he was a, you know, and that is exactly how they would have done it. Yeah. Because the guy, you know, the guy underneath, oh, he's taking the female role there. The guy on top, wow, he's macho. That's okay. And I thought when I saw that, I thought, yeah, you know, that's good because that is actually based on what they would have done. You know, the guy would have got off because, you know, that was okay. So they are actually more accurate in their costumes and their sort of social attitudes than the serious.
Yeah.
Which is kind of weird when you get a comedy that is like saying Dad's Army was much better than Band of Brothers, you know. But yeah, well, there you go.
So
I do think, you know, when you see the aesthetic and all that, I think there should be more effort to tell history right, because when you have like costumes, it is just, I mean, you get, say, the costumes. Okay, take Vikings. I mean, the biker leather armor. Yeah, they had leather armor, but I mean, if you've ever actually seen a one boiled leather, it is not body hugging. You can't sort of do a pole dance in it. It's heavy. It's cumbersome. And the women's costumes particularly annoy me because I don't think once in Vikings I see what would have been the standard dress for a reasonably well-off woman, which is the underdress, the shorter overdress, the straps with the brooches. You know, nobody wore that. Now you do see them in a lot of reenactments where they were all, most of the costumes for women in Vikings were vaguely medieval. They could have been Italy, Spain, they could have been anywhere in the Middle Ages. They did not say Norse, whereas that dress with brooches and that would. And the same with the men. Again, they were either dressed like a biker gang, they were like something out of a biker movie, or they were just vaguely medieval. You know, there was no real attention to getting a Norse costume correct. And then when, of course, they got to religious practices, I mean, your very strangely painted priests and all this were rather odd, because I think they really went over the top on that.
Yeah, and you see, the problem I have with all of this is the main point that we're trying to say here of what is a Viking. And I think TV programs are running away with this modern romance so much that it gets to the point that it is Norway, the pagan state of Norway, the pagan country, fighting the Christian England. And that's what it turns into. And it loses the magic of what is a Viking. That banter, that laugh of the lads.
It totally loses that aspect. It becomes almost a religious war, which it was not Crusaders versus Muslims. It wasn't that kind of thing at all. And also something that really annoyed me in Vikings, the way they always refer to themselves as Vikings. We are Vikings, you're a Viking, us Vikings, you know. No, they never called themselves Vikings. Nobody actually called them Vikings. I mean, if you had gone into a village in Ireland in the 8th century and said, the Vikings are coming, people would have said, well, what's a traveling show or something? Who are the Vikings? If you said the Norsemen are coming, they'd have scattered like cockroaches when you turn the light on. You know, nobody called them Vikings. They didn't call themselves Vikings. So this constant thing, I mean, you know, in King Harold in Vikings. We are Vikings. We were living like Vikings. Why do you keep saying Vikings? No, you never called yourselves that. Nobody said Viking. The English, I mean, Danes, Northmen, pagans, heathens, this kind. Yeah, Vikings. No, nobody would have known what the term Viking meant. No one who didn't speak Norse would have even understood the word. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons, the Gaelic Irish, who said Vikings, what's Viking? So this constant, you get this. You have the Vikings calling themselves Vikings, which they never did. Nobody else ever called them that. I mean, other people wouldn't even have known the term. I mean, the Franks of that wouldn't have known what it meant. These are just Northmen. They're heathens. They're Norwegians or whatever they happen to be. But when you have the Vikings in a show constantly referring to themselves as Vikings, because there is this image, and this I think is very relevant to the what's a Viking. People have the idea that Viking was a term of nationality. I'm a Viking, but it was a term of an activity. I mean, it was like going hiking. I mean, if you said to a German hiking through the Schwarzwald, what are you? Well, they're not going to say, I'm a hiker. They're going to say, well, I'm a German. I'm a German who is hiking. But this is the image for Viking, that it was some kind of term of nationality.
Yeah.
And all the Vikings came from one place. They were all together. They were one group. They were all Vikings. And that is very much part of the misconception, I think, of the word Viking. It is taken as a term of nationality, like being Swedish or Norwegian, rather than being, let's say, well, I'm a fisherman. Okay, that's not your nationality, that's your job. You could be a Norwegian fisherman, a Danish fisherman, a Swedish fisherman, or an Irish fisherman. Your nationality has nothing to do with what you're doing. And Viking was an activity, but it has become associated with nationality. And of course that has also been applied. I mean, they apply it to people from Iceland or people who were in Vinland for a while or anything like. Viking. They're everywhere. They're all Vikings. Which is like a 5-year-old kid. Oh, he's a Viking. She's a Viking. Yeah, the baby over there, that's a Viking. You look lovely in the helmet. And So these are pet peeves of mine. And when you think,
I know,
it's just as easy to make a correct costume as it is to make a wrong one. In fact, a friend of mine, she's an extra in Vikings, but she does full contact sword fighting, axe fighting, all this kind of thing, and she beats the crap out of nearly all the men she beats fights, and they really hate that. But I mean, like, she makes costumes, and they're correct costumes. It's just as easy to do that. So why make a costume that is wrong? And you can just as easily make a costume that is right. And I mean, you wouldn't have guys storming Omaha Beach in 1944 wearing scarlet coats, powdered wigs, and carrying brown bess muskets, would you? So I mean, why not try and get history right? Yeah. It just and the Vikings suffer, I think, more than anyone else. I mean, generally they get Romans reasonably right. They get medieval knights, they're pretty good. U.S. cavalry, no, but they're they are in blue. They're in blue, so that's a start. But the Vikings get everything wrong. This is really quite annoying. You see Saladin or something. Well, he's probably going to be pretty much like he would be. But then you see a Viking who is dressed wrong, behaving wrong, using the wrong words. Yeah, it's quite annoying to anyone who I think is interested in that particular subject.
I could literally rant about this all night. I really could. But we're finishing up now. After this is done, we'll probably end up ranting for an hour or so. Thanks very much, Denton. I swear you are always welcome on this program because the wealth of knowledge you have on your program. We'll put the links below.
Please, no, really, no, it's not. No. Oh, I'm going to do the false modesty thing. No, really, I don't. Yes, I do.
Please subscribe below, guys. Anyway.
Well, it's lovely. It's lovely having these little chats, sorting out everything, solving the problems of the world. Nobody's going to take the blindest notice of us. But what can you do? Voice crying.
Yes. No. It's really good to have you. And before Philip just summarizes here, it is true, that if they're gonna do, in my opinion, if they're gonna do something for the aesthetics, stick it in Hollywood. I've got no problem with that personally, but it has to be made clear that that's not what it is. You know the old before it started, like you see it in games and stuff now. None of this is historically accurate, or I know the Hollywood used to try and do that, like it's based on historical events, and really the only historical event was in a place called France. But I think something like that would really just clear it up. But yeah,
when you see that movie with Owen Wilson, who's playing the pilot who shot down in Bosnia.
Oh,
yes. He's hiding corpses. The only thing in that movie that was true was he was shot down, they picked him up in a helicopter.
Yeah.
Everything else never happened.
Yeah.
It is so loosely based on a true story that it isn't even true. None of it, apart from his being shot down, actually happened.
Yeah.
And that's Hollywood.
Yeah, but I mean, like I said, the museums and the documentaries really should be putting the nail on the head and they're doing it right. And
You should. All I can think of now is I think I will just get my ship and I will go off and raid a TV studio or something, burn it, and get my revenge. I probably wouldn't fit into that ship, but anyway,
Right, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Denton, you were a pleasure to be on the show. Could easily listen to you for another few hours, which we'll probably do after this anyway, unless you want to go to sleep.
If you want. I mean, now, as I was saying, I better shut up.
Anyway, guys, as always, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I hope you understand what a Viking is at the end of this chat, that it's mostly a Scandinavian or a person that's part of the Scandinavian world, a group of young lads in particular who have decided to take it amongst themselves to go off and raid the local village down the road, or even into another realm altogether. Ireland, Norway, Denmark, even all over the Scandinavian world and far off.
There were also some women involved in that as well.
Yeah,
we had there were a few of those, so they're not to forget that one.
Yeah, we kind of completely forgot that. Sorry, guys. We'll actually cover it in a completely different topic. We'll make a topic out of it. That sounds even better. So definitely, guys, subscribe. This is the new channel. Sadly, I had a disagreement over finance, so we had to finish up with that channel and set up this one. So definitely subscribe. We'll get back into the point where we're making money again, hopefully, so we can do these things full time. And definitely I'll put down Denton's channels below. And as always, subscribe over to Clans and Dynasties with Michael. Michael will be glad to have you. Any plans for upcoming videos, Michael?
Yeah, we're just finishing up the Butler Dynasty video here. So yeah, we're gonna. It's one of my longest ones actually for a clan-based or dynasty-based video. So
that would be good.
Yeah, well, it was such a big family after all, and I'm trying to get as much information into it.
I was actually down in one of their castles a couple of weeks back at Carrick-on-Shore.
Oh yes.
Where they had the tithe on all the ships coming up. And there's a lovely manor house built onto the front of it, so that was quite interesting. Well, that was one of their.
The longest thing about this video at the minute is mapping all those castles that because they aren't. A lot of them were destroyed during the Cromwellian invasion of Ireland, and are no longer really there's no records for them in the modern era of where they are. So I'm reading a lot of old sources to try and map these. So far I'm up to about 90 castles. So that are related to the butlers in some way. So when I'm done with that, the video will come out.
Nice. There's a lot of work. Anyway, guys, thanks very much, and we'll say goodbye.
Bye.